Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter
Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Rob Stewart, who's a professor of geography at Lakehead University. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
So let's start, back when you were a little tyke. Were you born in Thunder Bay? Give us a little bit of your history.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Thunder Bay. Grew up in Fort William. My dad was a city building and planner around the time when they amalgamated the city. My mom was a school teacher and spent, great years growing up in Northern Ontario until, of course, you turn 18. And one of the things you like to do is leave Thunder Bay. And
Go!
That's what I did, yeah. And, with a goal of traveling, seeing the world, but maybe getting some degrees along the way, so I showed I was doing something useful.
And so what did you end up doing in terms of degrees?
Well, I did an undergrad degree at University of Western, and this was the early days of the Rio Summit, the United Nations Summit around sustainable development. So I was really influenced by, environmental management, environmental assessment, all the things that our generation was facing with regards to pollution, point source pollution, and so forth.
Like the stuff we left you with after we
There is a lot of legacy, there's a lot of legacy problems that are being cleaned up while we're also dealing with, I think, emerging issues as well. So I went and lived in New Zealand for a few years because they had progressively adopted a lot of this management style from these large United Nations conferences. So I wanted to go learn what they were doing, particularly in protecting the marine environment, which is always a challenging area to protect. It tends to be where we like to dump everything. And then while I thought I'd live in New Zealand, but I really had a calling to come home. My dad passed away, and the landscape here I realized really was a part of me, and I came back to Thunder Bay and luckily started working at Lakehead as a summer job. And it's not that easy to get faculty positions, especially these days, and the stars were aligned for me to do that environmental work back at home, which was always a philosophy you had. Your profs would always tell you, the best thing you could do is, bring your education back to your hometown and start there, start locally, think globally, all of those sort of concepts. So I got to live that type of narrative, and it really is satisfying when I can work here and do environmental work and work in community, and it's my hometown. And of course, I'm a huge fan of Lake Superior, so I'm sure I could talk all day about that, and that is an excellent medium to focus your attention and efforts to protect and to conserve spaces more. It's such a motivator to do that.
So, geography. I'm kind of geography. I remember geography. We looked at maps, and what the capitals were of countries and provinces and all that kind of stuff. But geography's bigger than that.
Well, geography
give me a sense of geography.
I mean, you have to. The difference in geography is obviously techniques. We look at space and time, right? So we're trying to pay attention to what's going on with humans and the environment over space and time. It tells us a story. It tells us how we're affecting the planet, how it affects us, how we organize. So you might study, various aspects of chemistry, biology, sociology, whatever it takes to understand that social and environmental interaction, and then you look at it. You look at patterns in space and time to give you more evidence of what you think's going on. So geography is particularly useful for management issues and resolving problems today, environmental monitoring, understanding populations, more from a present day context versus, studying the past and geographers were the original frontiersmen, right? You would have a geographer going off into the frontier, exploring, and then once they figured out what types of plants and rocks and resources there, they would bring the other disciplines in who were much more focused, right, to do that very specific job. But it was always the geographer that was, once the frontier was breached, you were then pushing for the next frontier. So it's a bigger scale thinking. It's multidimensional, and so for that reason, lots of students in high school think it's just sort of about where places are and the names of things, and it's actually about that interaction of people in the environment that we're particularly focused on. So I really like it. I think in today's world we hear terms like environmental management or environmental sustainability, environmental studies. These are all identifying more the employment world, but those are all traditionally geography subdisciplines in the tradition. So, when you meet a geographer, you tend to find them a jack of all trades on one hand, and a little bit sort of insecure of who exactly they are, maybe a bit of an identity crisis, but very, very passionate, very, very much wanting to engage in civics or some sort of resolution of problems in society. It tends to be a geographer, and they go off and get jobs because of that motivation.
Well, on that point, Rob, so lots of times we think about the university as the ivory tower, and what you're describing really is an interaction much more with the community, with the environment around. How does that work out in geography and for you?
Well, I think trying to keep an abstract view of the business world, the governance world, the social world is critical, because as much as you have to be human, you're trying to observe those things in objectivity. So I think one of the aspects of any academic is to be objective, at least as much as possible. And that means not having an interest in one of those sectors, not benefiting from one over the other, keeping a neutrality. So, the ivory tower really was a symbol for where the academic and his one student lived, and they lived in seclusion so that they could keep this abstract, objective view of the world and then engage in helping the king's court or the mercantilism. So in our community here, it's really about practicing, listening to people, listening to stakeholders, trying to understand the problem without giving into a particular view of it, and more looking at either the resolution or where the conflict stems from. And then I think that is appealing to community members who don't want to necessarily work with someone who speaks above them or over them, that wants to engage in local issues. And that means the local person's the expert, and we're just trying to understand, mediate, bring those views to light, as opposed to forcing knowledge on people or forcing information on people. So it's a bit different of a role if you can give up the need to be an expert or somebody important.
Well, that is a different experience, certainly, with academia. Mm-hmm. So what areas are you kind of connecting with in the community? There's so much there.
Yeah.
You can't do everything.
Yeah. I think overall, like, environmental sustainability would be a good term. I'm definitely interested in Thunder Bay particularly becoming a much more sustainable city, embracing our population, and the fact that it stays around 100 and 108,000 is actually quite a sustainable achievement. And having some sort of balance in the job market and growth and protection in Thunder Bay, we have lots of opportunity for innovation. And for that reason, I think, thinking about sustainability and what that means to us, how we live a good life, how we sustain the things that are good, and that's a big conversation I like to have in my work in the community. And that's not just Thunder Bay. The smaller communities and First Nation communities around the region all have a different view on the same struggles around sustainability. And then, with the focus on Lake Superior in particular, I do philosophically believe with the view that the lake is there to dilute our pollution. And as much as we all love that lake, we tend to look at water resources very privileged. We think there's a lot of it all the time. We can use it all the time. We care for it, yet it is where everything that we dump out of a mill, out of a city, out of your garage, it's where it all goes. And we're not really paying much attention to how that long-term impact is going to affect, perhaps a global freshwater resource. So it's really easy, again, it's really easy to get into your work when you're studying things that are around you. Bringing students out on the lake and being out there is really important. It's not an easy lake to get on, and forming a relationship with it. So those are sort of how I look at the larger picture of my job. But then, like I said, the community dynamics. What does a community need to know? What do people in the community who are key players need to know to move forward? And sometimes the university's able to focus on that information and provide that when communities are pulled in very many directions.
So hang on to that thought.
Mm-hmm.
We need to take a short break.
Sure.
We'll be right back. Please stay with us.
Working together to make a better community. We can create.
Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Rob Stewart, a professor of geography at Lakehead University. So, Rob, we were just talking about, in a way, that engagement in the community. You talked about Thunder Bay is kind of sustainable. I was just thinking about this. In my lifetime, I've seen Thunder Bay go from 100 and change to 115,000 people. Now we're down to whatever, 108, or the sign is, and I'm kind of going, that seems to be unique. You know, most of the country is expanding like cities, or like in our region, where you have a one industry town and that those industries are disappearing, the community is shrinking. So so for Thunder Bay, the sustainable piece provides, you were saying, opportunities for innovation and stuff. Contrast that as well to those communities that are facing maybe that downsizing piece.
Well, I think with Thunder Bay, we have a region of populations that changes dramatically, especially in the last 20 years. So I think that's an important thing first to note when we think that Thunder Bay is a stagnant town and it's not growing, is that we have a really rapidly evolving regional area, the township of Shunia, the townships that are formalizing and increasing their property tax. So, so there is an aspect of our city, growing in that way, even though the city itself population is different because it's a regional hub. So thinking differently about cities and regions and their relationship is important. I think turning that Canadian model of funding going to growing cities is a really bizarre way of thinking about long-term cities, that if your city's not constantly growing, then it's not going to meet the property tax and commercial needs. Whereas in Thunder Bay, you've got, because of a lack of innovation, in a lot of ways, you have sort of a pressure to really rapidly transform at one time. So I'll give you an example in stormwater. Dealing with stormwater is an important problem for cities, but it's very challenging to deal with because it comes from everybody's property, right? And so stormwater efforts in Southern Ontario started about 15, 20 years ago, and really, making rules around how you had to treat your stormwater, or building bioswales and retention to slow stormwater down. And Thunder Bay, because it was a northern cold community, naturally is slow to adopt some of these practices that you might have the Toronto Conservation Authority adopt. And then the years that we weren't adopting stormwater, there was a buildup and a need for it. You could see it, you could start to hear it, people start to see it from other communities. And then all of a sudden there's sort of a critical mass of effort to adopt stormwater. And in a very short time, we adopted a plan, started constructing various structures around the city to capture water, innovative technologies to capture the water. And we really move into a good idea once we sense the trust and the viability of it. So there's this idea that innovation comes from that same energy, that people don't think about innovation. Innovation is something that you sort of stumble upon by accident, by doing really good work together, but you stumble upon that which you're trying to replace the current system. And so Thunder Bay can be a very innovative town. Another example is the industries we have on our waterfront. We have many derelict industries, but we also now have a critical mass of industries that need to go through transformation to upgrade the property zoning, to make them viable to new commercial development. And this spawns green economies. Engineers get trained on how to do restoration. Engineers get trained on how to do stormwater, and they've never done that before. Now they can go out in the market and attract people with that skill. And you start generating skills and money around cleaning up, restoring, or protecting stormwater, and it just snowballs, after that point. So these aren't the saviors of industry, but these are the diverse economies that we need to sort of balance the industry and health sector employment that we do. Health and education in Thunder Bay, and industry is our key employers, and we need to sort of fill that middle ground out with skilled engineers, skilled civil servants, new skills that are going to attract new monies to develop cities in a more sustainable way. I'll give you one more example of a city sort of like a town like Terrace Bay. If it doesn't have a hub like Thunder Bay, if the Terrace Bay mill closed, which supports most of the town, there is an example where we still have communities that are reliant on the survival of one mill. But because we've got new tourist links, new networks, a double-laned highway, Thunder Bay serves a bit more of a recognized region for Terrace Bay. They can survive perhaps on other forms of tourism industry by having that regional hub. So, when we start looking away from where we are in the city, what defines a city, to the region and some of these sustainable processes, then you see a different type of path, a different type of way of valuing a city without it constantly growing in numbers. And that's sort of one aspect of sustainability. Yeah.
So thinking about outside of Thunder Bay, Terrace Bay, as you bring it up, one industry town with a mill, and you're talking about now cleaning it up. Now we know there's a long history of pollution coming out of that mill in Terrace Bay. You're involved a little bit in tracking, mapping. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Terrace Bay mill and the work around it is very challenging because, of course, the value of the mill and the history of the mill built the town. But then the reality is it's a very old mill, and it might have grandfathered into certain operations, or it just has some aspects about it that are unique. So, for example, the mill complies with provincial regulation for effluent like every other mill does. So it's no different when it emits discharge and goes into the lake. That's legal. We pollute lakes so we can run mills, and that's something that it's good to be aware of. But before it gets to the lake, it goes through about 9 kilometers of a creek. So most mills would go through a pipe, go under the lake, emit this discharge, and you'd rarely see it. It would mix with the water, or in the case of Thunder Bay, it goes in the Cam River and flows out quite quickly. In Terrace Bay, there's no pipe. It comes out of the mill into a creek, meanders down the creek, goes through a few lakes, and then when it comes out into the lake, it comes out on the surface. So the challenge in Terrace Bay is you've got a mill in compliance and a mill that everyone needs, but on the other end, you've got this 60-year-old choice to put that effluent down a creek on the land, and that's what causes a contaminated environment that people are trying to figure out what to do with, because you can't stop the mill from operating, but now you've got to deal with this large ecosystem that's 96% hot effluent running through it. And then of course when it comes out into the lake, it makes sort of a liquor line, like a long line of foam and pollution on the top of the surface, and that's unique again because most mills are sort of. So it creates an aesthetic and an environmental awareness, even though it's regulated and allowed like every other mill, and that causes people a challenge. It hurts them. It hurts them to see the pollution, but know they need the jobs, and they know that they need to rectify that somehow. So our program studies the pollution, studies the impact, studies people's views of it, and tries to figure out, what could the mill do, or the government, or what can people do to either look towards cleaning these environments up, or maybe simply acknowledging that this is the cost of running a mill in Northern Ontario, is that we have to deal with some forms of pollution that we just don't like.
And so do you engage in some way with the folks in Terrace Bay to think about this, and in what ways? How do you do that?
Yeah, I'm really proud of that work. I have always had a coordinator help me full-time, so we get funding to have a coordinator who can, for the last 15 years, coordinate the Métis organizations, Red Sky Métis, the First Nations of that region, the people of Terrace Bay, even people that live in the old ghost town that used to be there before Terrace Bay was created. And we engage in regular monthly or every 2 months a meeting with that community group to discuss the pollution, the research we're doing, and their views around it. And then we meet with the federal and provincial government almost every 2 weeks to continue discussing our progress and really listening to the community. That I think is our big goal as a university, is to we can listen to the government, they can listen to us, we can share information really well, but we really want to make sure that community voice is not only loud as the rest of us, but I don't mean coherent in the sense that it's not intelligible. I mean coherent, and sometimes government and academics just speak a total different language, right? And acronyms. So
we have to take another break.
For sure.
Hang in there, Rob. Thanks so much, and we'll be right back.
Working together to make a better community. We can create.
Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Rob Stewart, Professor of Geography at Lakehead University. So Rob, we talked about Thunder Bay, a little bit about Terrace Bay. Let's jump up north to Lake Nipigon. Mm-hmm. So you've been doing some work in Lake Nipigon, and we talked a little bit earlier around community knowledge and scientific knowledge and how they meet. Tell me a little bit about your experience there in Lake Nipigon.
Well, that's been an amazing learning experience for me, working in Rocky Bay First Nation and working with community members and the youth and some of the commercial fishermen there, just learning about that lake, the 6th Great Lake. So there's a whole story, I think, around Lake Nipigon that many of us around here don't appreciate as much perhaps as the 4 First Nation communities that live there. And A lot of the work there is, typical monitoring data collection on the quality of the lake. The community is very concerned about the quality of the water because, of course, they drink that water, and they're concerned about the fish. There's a history of hydroelectric development, which can increase mercury levels in an ecosystem and then up into fish and into people. So Rocky Bay has a long history of commercial fishing and subsistence fishing, and they want to be able to, plan to catch the fish well into the future, not worrying about contaminants caused by development. But to get to your question, what I've really learned there is, that knowing that science isn't knowledge. Science is a technique for collecting data, and often to collect data in an environment that we're rarely in. And when you go work in communities where people not only have fished the same lake their entire lives, but learn from their grandparents, and who learned from their grandparents from the exact same spot. There's something about local knowledge that's just truthful. People speak it, they acknowledge it, they don't question each other, they've all seen the same thing. So knowledge, by sharing on the land, seeing the same things, seeing the same problems, that's knowledge versus, science, which breeds information, and perhaps we can broker that information and learn and become knowledgeable. But they go hand in hand, because when you go into a community and instead of being an expert and saying this is what you need to study, and you ask the community, what sort of challenges do you have in the area? What do you want from Lake Nipigon? What does your culture and your spiritual connection to the land say about what we need to know? It's easier as a scientist to now just go out and collect the information based on those questions. So scientists usually ask their own question based on previous literature, whereas when you can work with a First Nation who's sure of their story and sure of the things that have happened in the past, but now need some data so that we can hear it, so that it can be communicated to other people, that's really what science does. It provides this trusting relationship that we've lost with each other from being disconnected. And it's amazing to see how, you can go out with a commercial fisherman and we're going to lay nets to catch fish, and all the scientists are figuring out where to put the nets based on their protocols, and the fisherman says, well, we don't catch fish there, go over to this area, and sure enough we go over and catch a number of fish. And that level of practical knowledge can't be replaced by summertime researchers that are well-intentioned but zoom in for short periods of time. And so that's putting the communities in the position of deciding what questions they ask. What do they want to know? They want to know about the history of the lake before and after colonization. They want to know how their lives have been impacted by dams and diversions in addition to the pressures of today. And they want to tell that story, right? And they want people to understand that it's not just one development that's a challenge to deal with. It's one development on top of 20 developments and a history of development. And so really hearing about life through that lens is humbling, and lets you really see that science could be used very effectively to solve some of these problems, or at least create a conversation around the resolution of these problems.
So can you give us some real examples from Rocky Bay about, okay, so we've looked at the lake from different angles. Where do we go next, and how do we use this information, and are there opportunities or barriers?
Yeah, there's a number of smaller questions that I think helps the communities deal with individual developers or companies like mining companies. But the big issue with Lake Nipigon is that, of course, in the 40s it was diverted by the Army Corps of Engineers. An American military wing of engineers came up to the north shore of Lake Nipigon and diverted Arctic waters from a massive watershed into Lake Nipigon, so that one day we would have more power at Niagara Falls. Now just think about that for a second. Very little information on who knew about this, who allowed it, but ever since that time the lake has been affected. The water levels rise erratically, or erratically according to the people that have lived on the land. Number of hydro dams have popped up as a result of the diversion. You have different water coming in to the area with different nutrient levels, different sediments. You have submerged land from the diversion, which is what fosters mercury. So you have this story from 1940s that's never been told, and the communities know about it. They know how their great-grandparents were affected and how they were forcibly removed from rising waters with no notice. So the data that we're collecting, we use core samples to dig into the sediment, and it's sort of a record of time. Every layer of sediment is another phase of the past, and we can analyze everything from contaminants to the temperature of the water to the plants that might have lived at that time to even the erosion levels. So currently we've got data on our cores that show that, you know, since the diversion there's been more heavy erosion occurring in bays, and this matches what the communities know, what they've always been saying, but it's always been disputed. So there's an example where a very sophisticated technique of extracting data and analyzing it has produced just a very simple picture of history that matches this narrative that the communities are trying to express, that the lake has been heavily changed, and you know, they would like to address some of those issues, especially how it's affected their land, their rights, their treaty rights. So that would be sort of, I think in the long run, a very groundbreaking study that we're doing that's sort of helping the community empower themselves. They've already have the knowledge. They just, you know, could use some data to show everybody else that they've been, you know, telling that story all their lives.
And so how is the community able to use this new angle on knowledge you know, for the benefit of other communities?
Well, there are community members coming out with us and learning more about the results. So it's hard to obviously figure out everything about the coring and that, but there are students that want to now come to the university, right? Students that want summer training. So we're starting to build relationships that way. But there are community members who've been working with us for 5 years now and can understand what those cores mean and the sophistication of them and how to connect them to the narrative. The biggest aspect is that the community looks at us at the university as a partner, as not just an institution or a colonial institution, but they see us as helping them and part of a partnership that they trust, and that's a major step in helping the community, feel confident to articulate these shared results. Because of course, when you collect data, you are just getting a drop in the bucket and using the best information to honor your assumptions. And so having an agreed upon data set that it doesn't have a lot of conflict, people don't disagree with it, we can use it as a starting ground for conversation. That seems to be the biggest benefit.
So we're pretty much out of time, Rob, but it's interesting. My last guest was Patty Haidu, and we ended talking about reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And it feels like what you're doing is a step towards reconciliation, mm-hmm. which is building the capacity for the community, the Indigenous community, to tap in to the resources of our mainstream society mm-hmm. and universities. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your experiences. Want to remind folks that you can find us on Facebook, and these shows are on YouTube as well as on cable TV. Thanks so much. Stay safe and see you next week.